do that.
Okay, so there's 12 people already on that.
Good. A nice number. All good to go?
Yeah, I think we're good to go.
Great,
Yeah.
okay, thanks, Honey. So welcome to everyone in the room and welcome to all those online. My name is Professor Anne David and I have the privilege to chair this evening's event. Before I introduce Georgina, I'm going to just run through the outline of the programme of how we're going to do this. So I'll just talk for a couple of minutes as an introduction to this wonderful book launch. Then I'll give a little bit of a blurb and resume about Professor Georgina Horn's work, and then we'll go through to the discussants. Tom is online and Gavin is with us here. I'll introduce them before they speak, and then we'll have some time to have questions and answers. And I think for those online, we're going to ask questions to be put into the question and answer box rather than in the chat.
Yes.
Lovely. So we're very pleased. This is being hosted by the RAI, Royal Anthropological Institute, and also under the auspices of the Committee for Ethnochoreology and Ethnomusicology, which I'm chair. So we're sort of doing a joint sort of running of this tonight. So we're very pleased to have the launch of this book, Music and Digital Media, Planetary Anthropology. And I'm just before Georgina speaks, I'm going to give a little bit of her background. So Georgina is Professor of Anthropology and Music at University College London. Previously, she held professorships at the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge, Oxford from 2010 to 21, Cambridge from 2006 to 2010. And in her earlier life, she'd had a professional life as a musician in experimental music, rock, jazz, and free improvisation. Her work combines ethnographic and theoretical writings on music and sound, television and public service broadcasting, digital media, and interdisciplinarity. And I think it's nice to hear about the books. So her books include Rationalizing Culture, IRCAM, Boulez and the Institutionalization of the Musical Avant-Garde in 1995, Western Music and Its Others, edited book in 2000, Uncertain Vision in 2004, Music, Sound and Space, another edited book in 2013, Interdisciplinarity, edited book in 2013, Improvisation and Social Aesthetics, again an edited book in 2017, and then the book we're going to hear about today, which was really end of last year, beginning of this year, wasn't it? Georgina also directed the ERC, the European Research Council funded research programme, Music Digitization, Mediation, from 2010 to 2015. And in 2021, she was awarded a second ERC grant for a research programme titled Music and Artificial Intelligence, Building for Interdisciplinary Studies. I think we might hear a little bit about these programmes, these research programmes tonight. She's held visiting professorships at the University of California, Berkeley, where she gave the block lectures in music, at UC Irvine and at Oslo, Aarhus, McGill and Princeton universities. And in 2014, Georgina was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in Anthropology with cross-membership in music and culture, culture, media and performance studies, a new section of the British Academy for which she was the founding chair. This is actually a very important thing for the British Academy. It's a really high accolade. And in 2016, she was awarded an OBE for services to anthropology and music in higher education. And finally, she's currently editing a book called Music and Genre, New Directions with David Brackett. So over to you, Georgina's wonderful CV.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to open up my PowerPoint and okay, is that all right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's not on. Give me a moment. I have to, you've done nothing wrong. I have to get it on this one. Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think so, yeah. Thanks, yeah. Oh, is it coming up? Oh, okay. Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I hope, Tom, you can hear me all right, and everyone online can. So it's good to be here, everybody. Thanks for coming. And I'm incredibly grateful to Tom Belsdorf, Gavin Williams, and Anne for joining me to discuss the book, which I'm now going to introduce for about 40 minutes. So anthropology has, by and large, neglected the study of music. There are exceptions, but largely that's true. My book, Music and Digital Media, A Planetary Anthropology, shows how and why this should be redressed. It sets up a series of conversations between social anthropology, digital anthropology, and music. Through ethnographies of digital practices around popular folk, art, and crossover musics in the global South and North, as well as music platforms and music software, the book presents the first comparative portrait of music's entanglement in digital media worldwide. It's what I call an anthropology in the middle. It's inevitably already dated. A lot of the fieldwork was 10 years ago now, and it lacks discussion of TikTok, although 2 chapters do address music online through other platforms and social media. And yet this is the condition of doing digital research today. So the book enables music to expand the horizons of digital anthropology, demonstrating how the field can build interdisciplinary links to music and sound studies, theories of mediation, digital media studies, and science and technology studies. All of them, I think, necessary. A core conviction, then, is that research on music holds most promise for anthropology when it avoids disciplinary purism. There could be no anthropology of digital music, the book suggests, without forays into these other fields. But the same is true for the book's intervention in music studies, where popular folk and art musics are rarely brought into the same analytical frame, and where the view prevails that addressing music's socialities ineluctably leads to sociological reductionism and a neglect of music's sonic and aesthetic qualities, a profound methodological challenge that my work tries to overcome, although much more needs to be done. Music and digital media also develops a new model for comparative anthropology and comparative music studies, responsive to decolonization. It creates a framework for analyzing the social and political in music of wider relevance to anthropological and social theory. It therefore offers an entry point for people like you, for my students, for colleagues, impatient to bring music into anthropology's corral and anthropology into music's corral, because it demonstrates how music enlarges anthropology while demanding to be analysed with reference to classic themes of anthropological theory: the social, the material, politics, temporality, and ontology. So it's a big book, and it tries to do several things: substantive, conceptual, and methodological. It's proposing a paradigm shift, and in two directions. It's asking, how do disciplines change? And suggesting this is the time, it's overdue. Our disciplines are stuck in inadequate 19th and 20th century molds. I hope some of you, the next generation, and my students, will take this forward and be bold. Of course, I don't say this is the only way. Others are doing things that we haven't done, and that's, of course, valuable. Now, the book's origins, there's the cover, and that's the image is a sound artist in the UK that I worked on and with, Max Wainwright. But the book's origins lie in a 5-year research program which supported 9 ethnographies carried out by a fantastic research group, including really talented MPhil and PhD students. So I've listed them all there. And the MPhil student was Joe Snape, who did an incredible ethnography of the global music software Max, which I'll briefly allude to later. And the PhD student was Blake Durham, who did an exquisite online ethnography of 2 online music sharing platforms, an extra-legal peer-to-peer platform that we call by pseudonym Jekyll, and Spotify. So they did incredible work, and I'm enormously indebted to everyone in this group. Now, this scale of research is only possible thanks to valuable funding by the European Research Council, or the ERC, which the UK has just rejoined following Brexit, thank God. All the chapters are quite extraordinary, and each condenses a full ethnography. I'm not going to go through them now, but just to put, you can see there the extraordinary range of the book, from the question of a digital music industry in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, Jeff Baker's chapter, and a kind of corollary Andrew Eisenberg study of the born digital music industry in Nairobi in Kenya. Alex Bourdieu-Fournier, who worked both in Cuba and Montreal on the kind of urban consumption of digital music technologies, on prosumption and so on. A very important study in North India by Aditi Deo on projects involved in the digital archiving of oral folk musics. And then 2 chapters, Patrick Valaquet's in Montreal and my own, looking at the impact of digital technologies and creative economy policies in the Canadian case, in Quebec, and in the UK and Europe in my work. And we were looking at the transformations, aesthetic, material, and so on, going on in art music, digital art music, at this time. And I've mentioned Joe and Blake's chapters, and finally Chris Howarth, who did an internet ethnography of 5 key genres from the 2000 to about 2020, microsound, ontology, hypnagogic pop, chillwave, and vaporwave, where we do a lot of thinking about intermediality online as the kind of natural condition of music in this age, but also discuss aesthetics and the social forms that arise in these conditions. So the book has an introduction that sets the scene, and a postlude that attempts to draw out several comparative themes. Here are the chapters, and those comparative themes are kind of crossing the ethnographies. So I thought I'd just give you a glimpse of visually of some of the work. Here's Alex's beautiful photo from Havana, which is an amusing shot because, as she says, Cuba is deemed to be a pirate state. This is a licensed seller of pirated CDs in the streets of Havana. Here is a glimpse of digital cumbia live performance, the label Zizek, beautifully named, which was one of the key labels that Jeff studied, looking at the way that cumbia, this traditional music from Colombia that's now all around Latin America, has become hybridized with electronic dance music. Inside the studio in Nairobi, I'll come back to this, Jesse, the producer, is recording a Turkana musician in the booth, and together with the MIDI and the digital audio workstation, they're making Afrofusion, a new modernized traditional Kenyan music in their terms. A lovely shot of young women enjoying palpably using handheld devices to record live performance. This is hyperlocal digital algorithm, and they're recording an Adivasi music and dance performance in Gujarat. Again, we'll come back to this study several times. And now some glimpses from our work in Montreal in the UK, well, and in Europe. This is a circuit bending performance by Dasha Hewitt and Sarah Chuka in Montreal. This is post-digital sound art, a politically driven low-tech practice where they're working with wire and condense and found objects to create sound art as a reaction against the high-tech, the dominance of high-tech. And highly gendered. Women were the main performers of sound art in Montreal and couldn't get work as university-based trained composers. And finally, a glimpse of my fieldwork in Graz in Europe, but I was doing this also in the UK, and this is a snapshot of the enormous investment in infrastructure here. It's very costly, of a site-specific interactive digital sound installation in the University Arts in Graz, a piece called Zeitraum, which is, if you like, a form of digital high-tech modernism going on. But just a few snapshots from the work we did. So I'd like to now talk about the key kind of themes of the book, and I'll be talking about these until the end now. So in a way, the book was an attempt to put into practice the concept of a relational musicology, which I've developed in quite a lot of my writing since 2010. This is sometimes misunderstood. The way I use it is that this is about the inevitable coexistence, coevalness, adjacency of different musics, and the interest, the need to address them in their interrelations. And this is something I've done since the very beginning of my work, and perhaps most obviously in the book Western Music and Its Others. I also advocate for a certain understanding of the relationship between theory and ethnography, and I call it post-positivist empiricism, and I'll come back to that. I've already mentioned that the book is very committed, all of us in the research group, to interdisciplinarity. We don't think this kind of work can be done without that. We became interested in the question of decolonization, and I will shortly discuss how we address that through a dialogue with a recent book edited by Gavin Steingo and Jim Sykes called Remapping Sound Studies. We were also interested, I'll mention this in a minute, in reconfiguring the disciplinary boundaries between anthropology and music beyond music's enclaving within ethnomusicology. And I'm not alone in this kind of argument. I've listed John Blacking, Stephen Feld, Jocelyn Guibault, and perhaps others who are sympathetic to this kind of view. There's a comparative postlude to the book. After the ethnographies, we come back to think about how can we look across these ethnographies to draw out really interesting salient findings. And one of the things that we address is we rethink the ways in which we can see music as itself social. And I'll talk about this in a minute. In doing this, I bang the table and say we need to attend to institutions and organizations, because wherever we worked, the role of tiny to large national cultural and music institutions is enormously significant and important, and this tends to drop out of view in a lot of ethnomusicology and also even in anthropology. The postlude takes up the question of politics and how politics in music can be conceptualized, and makes a number of arguments I'll come on to. And this includes the idea of a politics of ontology, which I adapt from Anne-Marie Moll, who, as many of you will know, a leading figure in STS today, who coins this idea of ontological politics, but actually the way I want to talk about that is rather different. So I want to dwell in for a short time in each of these themes. I mean, a first question is how we should do comparison. And what we want to do in the book, I think, is to refashion anthropological comparativism. I mean, there's no claim in this book to capture a totality, and nor did we work with kind of pre-existing neat comparative templates. We did it differently. And most of the ethnographies themselves have internal comparison within them. And after fieldwork, we sat down and we drew out commonalities across the studies to develop these kind of comparative lines of analysis. It was quite extraordinary. To give you one quite unexpected finding, we found that creative economy, cultural industries policies had migrated all around the world, everywhere we were working, in Argentina, in Kenya, in India, often sourced to Britain, where this paradigm arose from the late 80s, otherwise sourced to North American paradigms. So this was completely unexpected, and we began to realize that policy plays an incredibly important role in some of the things we were looking at. But we also were insisting to ourselves on the singularity, the specificity of the places, the people, the musics we were studying. So we wanted to take care with comparativism. And so we turned to Gayatri Spivak and to an interpreter of her work, Tariq Jazil, who's a human geographer, a colleague of mine at UCL. And Tariq uses Spivak to develop this idea of planetarity, which stands against the abstract equivalence wrought by notions of the global, says Spivak. And he's, within geography, talking about a sort of dominant theory-led subsumptive comparativism, which places what's being addressed comparatively on a kind of plane of equivalence, folding them into classification. And instead, we argue planetarity leads out of this kind of reductive comparison and into the ethico-conceptual space of singularity, in which comparative research can be oriented to conceptual revision and experimentation. So in our work, we are integrating these ethnographies of popular, folk and art musics from the global south and north as they're enmeshed in digital mediation. And we wanted to approach these different scenes we were looking at as kind of distinct but contiguous musical worlds that have to be analyzed both in their singularity and comparatively in their complex coexistence. And so what we were looking at was, if you like, differences of aesthetics, of practice, and of discursive, social, and technological mediation of music. And they took a number of forms, these differences and relations between our sites. And I put down there several sort of examples of this. So, for example, in Aditi's comparative portrait of different organizations engaged in the digital archiving of Indian folk music, she underscores and brings out their vivid differences, but also their mutual awareness and sometimes sponsorship and direct links passing between them. And Blake's account of music's online circulation and consumption points not only to ideological and technological differences, but to borrowings between Spotify and this extra legal platform, Jekyll. So quite surprising to us that there were these direct borrowings between these entities. So to quote Eduardo Viveros de Castro, in pursuing this relational musicology that's employing comparison to open up these questions and to become aware of differences and singularities, I think our work exemplifies a comparativism that does not have similarity or identity as its formal or final cause. That's not what we're seeking to do. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of post-positivist empiricism. And what it's saying is that we're trying to overturn or destabilize a paradigm that I encountered when I worked in Cambridge a lot. I was working in a sociology department next to a whole bunch of social theorists. And their view was that social theory was the boss, and we who did empirical research, ethnography, and so on, were the kind of servants of theory. Yeah. So I want to destabilize this master-servant paradigm and advocate an altered understanding of the relations between theory and empirical research in order to put them, as Christabel Sterling puts it, contiguous or on the same plane. And I cite Deleuze, but I won't read that now. But the point about this is that the strength of ethnographic fieldwork is that it throws up findings, materials that can't be incorporated into existing conceptual frameworks, and in this sense demand that they be revised or extended. So ethnography becomes a kind of subtle tool through an oscillation between more deductive and more inductive moments to apply, but also to amend theory, with the effect that empirical research, ethnography, can have theoretical effects and serve as a site for conceptual invention. And I think this is something we don't talk enough about with our students, that we can actually do theory and be inventive theoretically with our fieldwork. So I want to talk for a little bit about how we conceptualize decolonizing music and sound studies in the book. And as I said, this is through a dialogue with the collection Remapping Sound Studies, edited by Steingo and Sykes, which has a very strong presence also of the wonderful, the leading ethnomusicologist of our day, which is Anna Maria Ochoa Gautier. Her presence, she writes an afterword to the book, and her presence is very strongly in there. So we revise what I'm going to call RSS in 3 ways. First of all, their book, is taking up Brian Larkin's famous imperative to not to go with normative portrayals of media technologies in the global south, the lack, the absence of decent technologies and so on, because this neglects the many contexts, says Larkin, where technologies are marked by interruption, obduracy, and failure, but with generative as well as negative effects. So this is sort of Larkin paradigm, and they take this up. And we have 2 responses to that. One is very simple, which is that by the time we did fieldwork in Nairobi and in certain parts of India, in Delhi for sure, there was a huge investment in high tech, in the same digital audio workstations, the same quite costly technologies that are found in the global north. So it's not any longer sufficient to take a kind of Larkin position on that. The second point we want to make is that the meaning of the kind of hybrid analog digital assemblages that we came across can't be read off the material components. And here I want to just show this couple of pictures that we have later on in the book. If you take a look at those 2 pictures, I mean, one on the left is a setup for a cable TV, a very, very local cable TV and radio setup in Maharashtra that Aditi took during her fieldwork. And on the right is a post-digital sound art performance setup from London from 2013, sent to me by a sound artist that I'm in dialogue with. And what's extraordinary and striking is how very similar these material setups look, right? But if we were to really understand and interpret what they represent, there would be radical differences. You know, on the right is a voluntaristic abjuring of glossy high-tech Apple tech, yeah, in favor of found objects, crazy wiring, a kind of curated set of objects that will produce sound through this kind of assemblage. And on the left is, you know, a bit of bricolage that is putting together the means of broadcasting sound and television in a hyperlocal way in a very poor area of rural India. Okay, so these are entirely different histories and ontologies behind these setups. The second kind of theme of remapping sound studies we want to discuss and take a different stance on is really Jim Sykes, who makes a very strong statement about the neglect of religion in sound studies and ethnomusicology as it's got into sound, arguing that, you know, religion and the secular are treated as mere auxiliary topics rather than as generating our very definitions within particular cultures of sound, the self, technology, and so on in the first place. So we reply, this is true, but we need also to trace the frictions between secularism and religion, also among, we found, among our southern interlocutors. For these ontological fissures between secular and religious run not only south to north, as Sykes implies, but south-south. And here I'd cite the chapter again by Aditi on India, in which the very scene, one of the key scenes she was studying, had this extraordinary split, tension between secular intellectuals and activists who are coming to record local folk singers who are deeply committed to Hinduism and for whom a saint a Hindu saint had bequeathed them their folk traditions. And so, you know, this ran through her fieldwork in Rajasthan. And in fact, this points to another aspect of our work, again highlighted by Aditi's work, which is the need to analyze social mediations. Because in her work, gender, caste, and class ran through, influenced the Indian folk music archiving projects that she was looking at, which entailed extractive encounters between these high caste professionals, secular professionals, and the folk musicians, showing how social relations mediate these sonic and religious material and ontological differences. And in this sense, I feel our work, and we argue, our work expands on the decolonial critique of power differentials and ontological violence between the North and South, because we show, in her work shows well, and actually Andrew Eisenberg's in Kenya shows as well, that these kind of differentials exist also between religious and secular formations within the South. So how, we could ask, how do social relations get into musical sound? In lots of ways. And again, this is a key theme that I signaled at the opening, arguing that we don't have to be sociologically reductive when we address the social in music. So, for example, in Rajasthan, as I've mentioned, Aditi was looking at a series, but this particular female folk singer, Gavra Devi Gosai, was one of her emblematic figures. And this is an elderly, blind, illiterate, low caste, but celebrated female folk singer. And as I mentioned, she's being recorded and produced by high caste, well-educated, male, largely, cultural intellectuals and activists. And when they work with her, as I'll show in a short film clip in a second, what happens is that these folk in the recording studio override her own aesthetics and reinterpret and secularize this poet saint, Kabir, who has inspired her and the wider folk tradition locally. And we have found a very similar kind of process at work in Kenya. I'll show a film clip shortly in which this Turkana musician, Abdi Jero, has been brought from the north of Kenya to be recorded by a Nairobi production house called Kerebul for their series of recordings, and they also produced a book called Spotlight on Kenyan Music. And this project by Kerebul is being funded by the European Union's Non-State Actors Programme and Total Oil under a creative economy development imperative. And so in the studio, we'll see in a second, this illiterate Turkana musician from a marginalized community in the north is being produced by sophisticated Nairobi engineer and producer, Jesse Bukindu, who, you can't see that, but the musician is wearing phones in the booth, and he's got a click track playing, which is absolutely regular 4/4, to regularize his rhythms. And Jesse will later spend, as Andy says, many hours arranging the track on the DAW after the singer has laid down the primary tracks to produce a new sound that they call Afrofusion. So once again, Abdi Jero's own sound, including this much less 4-square rhythm and indeed pitch qualities of Turkana music, is being overridden and radically revised aesthetically. Okay, so let's just take a glimpse of this. These are 2 short clips. Here's Gavra Devi, and you can see she's kind of palpably rather uncomfortable in the recording studio here. Was in fact her first experience of working in the studio. And here is the Turkana musician inside the booth with Jesse Bukindu. Whoops. Okay. I don't know if you caught that, but the last few seconds you hear these 3 chords going on. It's a 3-chord standard minor key 3-chord accompaniment. So once again, a kind of flattening of the harmonic and melodic contours of the original. So finally, in our dialogue with Remapping Sound Studies, we come to the ontological turn in sound studies. And here they cite Ochoa's acoustic multinaturalism, which is insistent that we should attend to how key words in sound studies like listening, deafness, silence, noise emerge with different genealogies, manifestations, and theorizations when thought from different experiences in the South. And we want to just raise some questions in relation to this position, which has some definite signal purchase and interest, I think. On the other hand, I mean, my own position is that I feel this stance is more concerned with concepts and forms of thought and language than with ontology. And you know, it rests a lot on Viveros de Castro's idea of the ontological turn in anthropology. And at the bottom of this page, I've really just put a couple of queries to Viveros de Castro, to this general stance within anthropology. To quote David Graeber in one of his long pieces responding to Viveros de Castro, you know, if the ontological self-determination is a political project, then why do accounts of its political implications not engage with terms like serf, slave, caste, race, class, patriarchy, police, poverty, hunger, inequality, and so on? And I broadly agree with Graeber's critique on that. So how to decolonize? You know, the thrust of our work is that we have to change the disciplinary boundaries. And we want to contest this tendency I mentioned at the beginning to cordon off music from anthropology through ethnomusicology, like this safe space where music can be addressed. If music has been deemed marginal to anthropology, it's because music belongs to ethnomusicology, and that's very strange because that's despite music's intimate links to a series of arts with which anthropology does engage: poetry, dance, theatre, film, and so on. And yet ethnomusicology continues to be defined largely by the ethnos, its focus on other musics, the musics of other peoples from the global south, from the non-West, that the ethnographer is there to represent or to collaborate with. And I think the thrust of our book is that this is no longer ethically and politically supportable. Instead, the argument is that music anthropology should critically address all musics using similar conceptual tools, a wide range. And here, the influence is felt of a collection long ago, a critical anthropology from 1986, the book Anthropology as Cultural Critique, which has kind of appeared and was influential at the time and then kind of completely dropped away. And in the introduction, I kind of resurrect it and argue that its vision remains rather powerful. And it was reimagining anthropology's future at the time in the late 80s. So Anthropology as Cultural Critique sought a repatriated anthropology that took the North, that would take the North as well as its object, as well as the global South. No longer is the project of anthropology, it proclaimed, the translation or defamiliarization of the exotic. Instead, it should study ourselves, home societies, with as much detail and rigor as other societies. So after Anthropology as Cultural Critique, we want to propose a critical anthropology of music, encompassing North and South, one that conjoins ethnography and history, that crosses scales, and that brings matters of politics, economy, the social and cultural, and their interleaving into the analytical frame. That's the project. So where is the social in all this? I want briefly just to mention that the book is interested in this framework, which I've developed over a number of years now, that we can't think of music being social in just one way, but rather we can explore several ways in which music engenders socialities, in the micro-socialities of embodied musical practice, but also in the virtual collectivities, the kind of musically imagined communities unleashed by our love, our passion for music, these kind of affective alliances that music creates. But we can also be interested in the way that music is crossed, traversed, influenced by wider non-musical social relations and identities, by formations, as I've been pointing to, of class, caste, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on. Fourth, we can be interested in music's institutional and political economic forms. As I mentioned at the beginning, a striking feature of our ethnographies is everywhere we worked, there were these extraordinary organizational, from tiny ones to giant arts councils, university music studios, and so on, all of them deeply involved in the creation, circulation, and reception of music. And fifth, we argue that in this book, we introduce a new kind of sociality, that is online formations, the music platforms, in which the technical design is imminently also the design of certain kinds of subjectivity and social relations, if you like, an intimate governmental apparatus. And this is most apparent in Blake's chapter on this extra-legal platform, Jekyll, which he does an extraordinary analysis of how it has generated these really strange, very highly regulated forms of activity and practice in music downloading and sharing. So in this sense, the book shows all five of these planes of social mediation get into music. So finally, maybe I will talk about politics. And again, towards the end of the book, we're able to kind of take stock and see the many ways that politics gets into music in the ethnographies we've been looking at. And one of the striking things is that these five planes of the social, that's often where politics is kind of happening, is being enlivened. On the one hand, these five kinds of social in music will not always foment a politics. And when they do, the politics isn't always progressive. But what is clear and what became very interesting is attending to both when a politics is incited along these lines, but also when it isn't, or there is no politics, or it's only weakly incited. And so I coin these two terms, the occlusion and the compounding effects. And the occlusion effect, to give an example, is when how a politics on one plane can have the effect of occluding or rendering inaudible or less audible the absence or the weak development of a politics on another plane or of another kind. So from my fieldwork in the UK on digital art music, the emergence of a number of different kinds of digital art music enacting various kinds of politics of ontology was not accompanied by a politics addressed to the neoliberal university, which is where these things are happening. And only weakly, the most clear politics in this scene was a politics of gender around digital art music and sound art, because these scenes are highly gendered male. And so a politics of gender had got going, but not politics where else you might have expected it to develop. So I call this the occlusion effect. And on the other hand, there's the compounding effect, which is the idea that this is when a politics arises on several planes of the social in music, but they act synergistically together to create an incredibly reverberant, decentered, and distributed kind of political effect. And the best example from our ethnographies is again Aditi's fieldwork in India, where she charts the politics around this particular institutional project, the Adivasi Academy, which is it involves a politics of indigenous, tribal, if you like, self-determination in which an indigenous institution, this Adivasi Academy, which is an educational institution training Adivasi young people in digital literacies and musical literacies, that indigenous institution is allied to an indigenous social movement, a wider social movement for indigenous rights. And together, these two initiatives enable self-representational music recording and archiving practices. Remember, in marked contrast to that other project in North India, where external intellectuals are coming in to record low-caste folk musicians. So this is self-representational archiving practices by Adivasi people as these politics coalesce and are effectively bonded through the musically imagined community aroused by the music, by Adivasi music. So this together was an extraordinary kind of sense of the politics being synergistic, compounding. It's being compounded across a number of dimensions of the social existence of this politics, of this music. So I think I should wind up and just say thank you for listening. And I look forward to the discussion.
Well, I think we should. Thank you, Georgina, very much for that very layered and rich analysis of the book, and I hope it's encouraging everybody to read more. Before we go on to questions, we're going to have two respondents, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'd like to welcome, first of all, Tom Belstorff, who's joining us from California. So welcome, Tom, and thank you for coming on early your time. We do appreciate that. And I'll just give, before you start, Tom, I'll just give a little bit of your bio so everybody is aware of your background. So Tom is Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and former Editor-in-Chief of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal of the American Anthropological Association. Their research has focused on topics including climate change, digital culture, disability, game studies, globalization, HIV and AIDS, language, nationalism, queer studies, and the history of technology. They're the author of many books. I'll read some of them here. The Gay Archipelago, Sexuality and Nation in Indonesia, A Coincidence of Desires, Anthropology, Queer Studies, Indonesia, and Coming of Age in Second Life, an anthropologist explores the virtually human. And they're co-author of Intellivision, How a Video Game System Battled Atari and Almost Bankrupted Barbie, and Ethnography in Virtual Worlds, a Handbook of Method. Many articles in many journals, but also Tom's worked as a consultant for the Intel Corporation and Microsoft Research and advised several community-based HIV/AIDS organizations in Indonesia. It's a bit of a potted bio, Tom, but welcome to this very interesting book launch, and over to you now.
Thanks so much. And I might show just one image later. So I think my share screen, I'll be able, yeah, it looks like I can, so that should be fine. So can everyone hear me okay?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. It's such an honor and fun thing to be here all the way from California. This is my Second Life office I'm sitting in right now, but and it's a special pleasure because, and thank you for that bio, the many trails of my life. But another trail is that one of my bachelor's degrees from Stanford University is actually in music. And my advisor was Leland Smith, who John Chowning was sort of the founder of Karma, if you know what that is, which is sort of a foundational organization around computer music. And so, and I majored in composition. And so I have this music background that I don't get to itch very often nowadays. So, so this is a particular pleasure in that regard. And with that hat on, also just, as you got the idea from Georgina's wonderful overview, which I could never attempt to replicate, that this is a Wagnerian book because it's a big project with lots of moving parts and lots of interesting, I mean, just an amazing collaboration. And so what I'm going to do in the 12 minutes that I'm supposed to be doing here is just bring up 4 things because it's so big. I can't try to summarize or whatever. And these aren't even necessarily the 4 biggest things or top things. And these are all things that are already in the book. So it's not sort of pointing out something that's missing. It's sort of reinforcing stuff that's already in the book in various places. I won't always, sometimes I'll flag that, but I can't do all of that. But just sort of some things that I think would be interesting in that pull on projects from my undergraduate years of music to my Intellivision book that you heard about that's coming out next year with MIT Press. So the first thing is there's a lot of interesting stuff here about the digital versus the online versus the electric or even the recorded with regard to technology and music, right? Because with music you have, Thomas Edison and records, and then you have the rise of electric stuff with cassettes or radio or whatever, that kind of thing. And then you have digital music like MIDI, which is talked about as a really important example, but that doesn't have to be online. Right. So digital music isn't necessarily online music. Online music is always digital, but digital isn't always online. And so there's some really interesting work that's happening in this collection to think about the relationship between digital media and digital music with regard to when that means online and when it doesn't. And that also brings up really interesting points about technological determinism, which comes in throughout the book. How do we think about affordances and effects without it being determinism? And actually, with regard to MIDI, in Jaron Lanier's book, You Are Not a Gadget, talks about lock-in and the way that like when MIDI gets established, just like JPEG or PDF or something like that, formats can have these enduring effects that can include social effects, which is something that's being looked at. And the key role of organizations, which you just heard Georgina mention, I think is a really interesting piece of all this. Because when we're talking about platforms, and so much online stuff basically nowadays is a platform in one way, shape, or form, most platforms are nowadays owned by corporations. There is an open source internet out there, but it is relatively weak and minor. The recent OpenAI events can remind us of that. So like in the case of my Intellivision book, Intellivision was created by Mattel, by a toy company. And that really, and actually by people who were working on music and toys. They created originally Chatty Cathy, which was the first talking doll. And so the role of corporations and organizations in shaping these things, I think, is really important. And also this point that Georgina just mentioned about how you can't read off platform effects. And in my Intellivision book, we talk about this idea of trans-platform as one way to think about that, where in some ways, like the Atari and television rivalry itself is a kind of trans platform. And so just as a way to think about an example of that determinism, Intellivision was the first generation where you could have video game cartridges separate from the machine, like records or music separate from before then you had Pong or Pac-Man and it would play that thing, right? And it was the rise of the separation of hardware and software, for instance, that allowed third-party game makers who wouldn't make hardware at all, but only make games, right? Like you can only make music. Take form. And 2 of those that were formed in the late 70s, early 80s around Intellivision and Atari, one of them, Activision, is still around, right? 40 years later. Okay, a second point is thinking about the digital media relationship, which comes up all over in this book. I cannot overemphasize the importance of remembering that not everything digital is media. They are not synonyms, right? And we see this like when Georgina was talking about virtual collectivities or online social technical formations, which I would just call online places. That is not mediation. Those are not mediation. Those things are places. So when Travis Scott is in Fortnite with 12 million viewers in a music event in Fortnite, or you're in Second Life or whatever kind of thing, those things are places and you can have media in them, but not everything online is a place. And there's really interesting implications of that, obviously, for thinking about music. And this is the kind of fifth plane stuff that I'm playing off of. But anyway, that relationship between digital and media, because media mediates things that aren't media themselves, right? Media is not the same thing as the social, right? Which is something that really comes out. A third thing here is the digital versus physical and the online offline relationship. So at one point in the book, there's a quote from Jenna Burrell about digital ethnography is most productive when it abandons this tendency to draw a sharp division between offline and online places. This is completely wrong, utterly, completely wrong. It is right, and I write about this extensively, right? The online and offline is a realm apart, both materially and semiotically, and with very sharp divisions. The zeros and ones of the digital are not a big mush of 0.5s. The word sun is not hot. The word red doesn't have to be red, right? These things don't all mush together. And so, right now I'm in Long Beach, you're, in London. These are two different places. They are not blurring, right? And the same thing if I'm in Second Life or I'm in one of these virtual communities. So the online offline are very, very distinct, very, very separate in a range of ways. And one reason this is very important that Georgina and others talk about is if you think that there's no division, you lose the ability to talk about relationality and relation, which is the really important thing we want to think about. So there's sharp divisions both between offline and online and within each, right? So there's a sharp division between Roblox and Fortnite. There's a sharp division between Spotify and Pandora. There's a sharp division between California and Sumatra, depending on your definition of sharp, right? But there's all kinds of relationalities. And if you make it into a big gray mush, then you can't talk about that. So I think that's something that is really important. And because there was a lot of mention of ontology and Viviero de Castro, if you ever look at my article, For Whom the Ontology Turns, where I talk about this work, one of the biggest problems in this space is this tendency to talk about real life or the real versus the online, which is not what happens in this book, right? I'm reinforcing something that is happening in this book, is that those are independent variables. Things online are not necessarily real. I could be a dragon eating you right now in an online game, but this is real. And reality also, the danger of that real life language goes in both directions because it encodes an assumption that everything is physical is no real, is everything physical is real, right? I live next to Hollywood, people. Right? There's Halloween, there's Shakespeare, right? There's acting. Not everything physical is real. That's the part that freaks me out almost more than the assumption that everything digital is fake, which robs us of the ability to talk about the politics, right? So these are independent variables. Not everything physical is real and not everything physical is unreal, right? And so we really need to keep in mind how those are independent variables, which is something that really comes out in this book. And that also gives us a way to talk about sameness and difference and sort of these relationships of similitude and difference that come out so much. Because one thing I talk about in my For Whom the Ontology Turns article is what the ontological turn pivots on is difference. And that's a big weak spot for anthropology historically, right? Our job is to find difference, right? Sameness is boring. It looks contaminated, right? And we really need that anthropology of similitude empirically and politically. And this also gives us a way, just by the way, to think about materiality is also not only being about the physical. So like when Georgina talks about material actants, there are digital material actants, obviously, right? You can have a virtual instrument. You can be in a virtual place. Materiality is not limited to the physical. So my final point is about comparison, which is a really wonderful part of this big project. And this is so important theoretically and politically because on all sides of the pond and in the global north and south and everywhere, often one way that anthropology gets marginalized is this idea that you just heard Georgina talk about, that sort of, we do the case studies and other disciplines get to generalize. And that idea that anthropology doesn't get to do comparison or generalization is very dangerous. And it goes against the way that anthropology has done it for over a century. That servant of theory idea that Georgina was talking about. And instead, it gives us ways to think about comparison as distinct from generalization, which is something that shows up in the book a lot, but also to think about comparison as forms of connection and forms of borrowing, right? The sort of reinterpret and secularize point that you just heard, it reminds me in my Indonesia work, I talk about dubbing culture when Indonesians use like a word gay or lesbian for their subjectivities. The idea of translation is haunted by its inevitable failure, but with dubbing, you just hold two things close together and the lips never match what you're saying, but as long as you can figure it out, it works. It's about a pragmatics, not a semantics, and it doesn't have this kind of sort of fantasy of fusion, right? And that kind of dubbing is a way of thinking about comparison as connection, I would say. And that's really interesting. It reminds me, I've talked before about sort of a critical empiricism that asks after the relations of adequation between any theorization and the discursive realities it claims to interpret, right? And that kind of critical empiricism, I think, is something that's showing up here a lot in this work on comparison. About when in my book, A Coincidence of Desires, I have a chapter called Comparatively Queer, thinking about queering comparison. And this book does that so wonderfully, because one thing I talk about in that is that the boundary between the ethnographic and the comparative is analytical and political. It's not a priori. Like, how big does a field site get before it's comparative, or what, that's not out there in the world, online or offline. That's a analytical and political, right, kind of engagement that shapes those frameworks. And so that's something that I thought was very interesting. And in terms, my final point then, in terms of thinking about comparison, is it's really wonderful to be able to do that around music, right? And that is something that music gives you with all the work on genre and style and comparison. And I think one way that this book will be influential is that people who do work on, let's say, Instagram on images, right? Or TikTok videos, or, other, LinkedIn, right? There's so much content creation, and sort of user-generated content is now one of the primary economic models online, right? Other than advertising, or linked to advertising, actually. And I think this provides a really interesting framework that people who are thinking about these kinds of dynamics with regard to other forms of art, but just other kinds of influencer and content creation in general, that music can be a great analytical window into that. And I think that's really, in saying so, I'm re-emphasizing this point that rather than carve off music into a realm of ethnomusicology, we don't do ethno-choreography or ethno-painting or ethno-film. That cordoning it off like that robs us of being able to draw on this, right? This kind of work, to think about those broader dynamics. So I will leave it there once again, with no claim to being remotely comprehensive, because there's so much wonderful stuff in this book. But I really enjoyed engaging with it and really appreciate the chance to be here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tom. And we've really enjoyed, even though it might not be real, your lovely background of the ocean, because we're sitting in very cold, dark London at the moment. So thank you very much for joining us and for that. And I think before we have any response from Georgina, we'll move on to Gavin, who is sitting in the room. It really is a reality here. And briefly to introduce Gavin, so thank you again for coming along. So Gavin completed his PhD in music at Harvard with a dissertation entitled Arts of Noise, Sound and Media in Milan, circa 1900. Since then, he's held a variety of appointments researching and teaching music and environmental humanities, a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, a Leverhulme early career researcher at King's College London, a lecturer at the University of California in Berkeley, and a research associate at Cardiff. And he's currently at King's College London. His research interests cover 19th and 20th century music and the environment, sound studies, energy, humanities. And he works on the history of listening in the 19th and 20th centuries. His book, which I think is due out next year, from the University of Chicago Press, is titled format friction, perspectives on the shellac disc, and it explores the materiality of listening to recorded music from global and environmental perspectives during the first half of the 20th century. Shall we leave it there? Are you happy with that? Good, yes. Lovely. Well, there's plenty more there, but I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction, and thanks so much for the opportunity to give some thoughts today. I think, like Tom, I'm going to just sort of get my excuses in early. I can't synthesize this. I will just offer some kind of sporadic sort of thoughts. I remember when the book came out, I said to Georgie, "Oh, it looks like it's right up my street." And now having read it, I can report back that I was correct. It was right up my street. I thought that perhaps a good use of my time, in this right now, is just to think about what it might mean for my generation of music scholars, such as we are, with so many different, agendas, interests, precarious employment situations, and inevitably and unavoidably grappling with the many entanglements of digitization in musical and sonic life. So we've already heard from Georgie about the book's structure, scope, and many achievements, and as well as Tom about its anthropological stakes and interventions. So I think that the book does extend a very warm welcome to anthropologists who are interested in working on music but might otherwise be reluctant to join the party. Like Mac's music software, perhaps, but without the black boxing, and in a spirit of openness and transparency, music and digital culture offers a powerful ensemble of instruments and tools, together with models and styles, to provide guidance and inspiration for anthropological research. Yet the book also represents a systems upgrade for music and sound scholars. My first impression on reading the book was that my iOS system was demanding to install a new software package of the kind that may require turning off your computer for several hours, if not weeks. In fact, I have the feeling that it's going to take me a lot longer to get my head around the ideas and challenges of this book. For example, the notion of planetarity, mentioned in the book's title, which immediately signals a new gesture in the field. Think comparatively without equivalence and across scales. Georgie makes an impassioned case for studying musical cultures and assemblages in their singularity, but at the same time shows how those singularities can bear and might even encourage or even demand comparison. In other words, our thinking should not stop once the work of cultural and ethnographic study is over. There's a rich, and I think this book suggests, urgent plane of critical reflection to be accessed between the musical assemblages, between ethnographies, and which must be entertained if we are to understand musical practices in all their worldliness. So here we alight again on the Steingo and Sykes issue that we've already heard about. So I'm not going to say too much about that, but just to say that this book, I found it really useful in my own research. I work not so much on the global south, but I still find the concepts very, very handy and sort of generative. And they sort of made this idea for an urgent steer towards the global south as an area that sound studies routinely overlooks. And so for them, the field's bias towards the global north goes hand in hand with this kind of fetish for sound technologies, whose origins and early spread recursively encourage a kind of focus on North America and Western Europe. In this context, what is needed, they argue, is to ditch technology fetish and reorientate the field around sound's constitutive technicity, the multiplicity of material and bodily practices that underpin sound and musicking, techniques that have no clear origin or ending and may allow us to turn towards the global south without one fewer epistemological barrier. Now, so I think that they're surely right when they diagnose this kind of emblematic bias. And I've used this idea of constitutive technicity in my work on proletarian gramophone cultures in interwar South Wales, a region not in the global south perhaps, but southern nonetheless. And yet, as several of the chapters in Music and Digital Media remind us, the reduction of technology to technicity does not necessarily help when studying music of the global south. Both Andrew Eisenberg's work on digital popular music in Nairobi and Aditi Dio's ethnography of the archiving of vernacular musics in North India show how countless big systematic black box technologies, sometimes adapted and creatively transformed, are often central to musical assemblages. What is more, and as the rhetoric of turning to the South might already suggest, even a pragmatic and temporary focus on the global South provides an opening for creative and critical reflection on the relation between South and North in sound studies as elsewhere. This is a delicate operation, of course, and one fraught with scholarly risk. However, as music and digital media argues, it is a risk that we should be taking. I'm just going to read a bit from the postlude to the book, if I may. And I'd like, it's on page 480, if anyone has it as a PDF online and they want to sort of follow along. But it's a short passage where these planetary comparisons without equivalence, I think, come into sharp focus. So, on the basis of our studies then, transnational patronage in the South is capable of supporting radical political experiments in music's social mediation, while Northern universities host more circumscribed musico-social experiments in the politics of ontology. Out of context, this is hard to sort of take, but I'll keep going. A final remarkable contrast between our studies in the South and North turns on the relationship between genre and audience. It comes to the way in which digital popular musics in Kenya, as we have seen, hone their skills in crafting novel hybrid sounds at the same time as working inventively to assemble new audience coalitions. In contrast, in the UK and Montreal, among many practitioners of digital art and crossover musics, genre is taken not to be a productive force, but vexing, a perennial problem, even obsolete. Now, this passage comes near the end of the book and is the outcome of formidable intellectual labor, right? Not only contained by, the ethnographies on which the passage is drawing and the theoretical elaboration that underpins them, but also the labor of comparison, which involves an exactness of imagination supported by a long-standing commitment to questions of music social ontology. Some of that commitment and exactness is revealed in an ellipsis to the passage that I didn't read, which identifies the different intersecting planes of social mediation through which popular music in Nairobi achieves novel coalitions. Such precision and imagination, in turn, propels us back to the global North by way of an unflattering comparison with the UK's digital art music scene, in which collective imaginaries and hierarchies are routinely ignored or disavowed in favor of peer-to-peer squabbles between musicians themselves. Okay, so all this, I think, represents a wide and open field of possibilities for music scholars in the 21st century, and it's not by coincidence, I don't think, that such possibilities have been brought into view through a book on music and digital culture. While the book's opening rallying cry calls attention to the way in which music decenters the digital, and this I think it surely does, as we've heard already, it is also the case that a sustained reflection on digitization might decenter music and sound studies. By way of wrapping up then, I'd like to just mention some of the ways in which the book suggests to me as a music scholar that this might happen. So echoing kind of Tom's vision of this from an anthropological perspective. So, one, by continuing to investigate music's ontology, in drawing our attention to what Georgie calls digital and otherwise materialities. Now, there has been a pronounced tendency in studies of music and digital culture to contrast digital and analog, right? This kind of comparison. Yet, digitization actually calls attention to the opposite, right? Admixture, messiness, or what the postlude describes as the impurifications endlessly churning away at the heart of musical life. Okay, the second way in which digitization decenters music and sound studies, I think, is in identifying what is novel or emergent in digital musical formations. So having debunked the notion of a clean break between digital and analog, or between digital and non-digital, although I think, as Tom says, there is important distinctions to be made there. musical and digital media invites us to ask with new clarity, what is emergent in music, in digital musical assemblages? So one of the key contributions of the book is to identify ways in which music streaming platforms such as Spotify and Jackal provide and present a new kind of intermediary and generate novel forms of musical music social mediation, as has already been discussed. And my final page, and my final point, in encouraging us to explore the ways music is or is not political. Now, this might seem like a really obvious point, but it is, for me, one of the subtly subversive aspects of music and digital media. It would certainly represent a sea change in music studies, in which by now music's very being is assumed to be political always and everywhere, right? All that's left for us to do is to figure out how, right?
Yeah.
And yet, a robust analysis of music's social ontology must be able to account for situations in which music fails to become political, or only weakly so, as I think just now. So another important aspect signaled in the book's closing pages, as we already heard, are those occlusion effects, you know, the many experimental music projects that confidently proclaim their sonic inventiveness and often declare their commitments to pressing issues of social justice, even as they routinely refuse to engage with their embeddedness in long patterns of institutional exploitation and organized inequality. So, this is by no means a complete list, and it only deals with a small part of what is a wide-ranging and exhilarating postlude, itself only an element in the constellation of the larger book. But I hope that my response will represent at least some of the things that colleagues in music and sound studies will also have on their minds, and so can feed into the conversation, which music and digital culture so generously invites. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we have two questions online, but do you want to respond first? Is that how would you like to do this? I'm sure we'll have some questions in the room.
I think we'll go to questions in a minute, because thank you both very,
Yes.
very much. I mean, they were tremendously interesting. I'll just sort of pick up a couple of things. Tom, you know, we'll have to have a longer conversation because there are obviously things there that I need to get hip to. But I thought, by way of many interesting and subtle points you made, I was very pleased that we collide and agree on what you're calling a critical empiricism. And, you know, the idea that the analytical and the political, as you put it, is going to be partly in those operations that we undertake on the material, on the ethnography. I was thinking about your insistence on similitude and not dissing similitude completely. And I'm with you. I guess for me, the question of different similitude comparison is never for that to be overdetermined in advance, and for it to be emergent from our work with the material. And that's where comparison is so powerful. You know, it was like, it took a lot of work, as Catherine said, to pull these things out. But, you know, it's so interesting how the limits of one ethnography are that you can't create these incredible kind of, you can't see things because you can't see the difference with something else, and that, or the similarity. And so that whole analytical operation, the one quote from Viveros de Castro I went for, is like that, you know, comparison is for that, and that can't be judged in advance. I thought the second you raised, you didn't kind of pin it down, technological determinism. And I think, I mean, in media studies at the moment, I don't know where Gavin stands on this, or there's a kind of return of technological determinism, John Darren Peters and so on, people kind of defending it. What are we to make of this? We all know both sides of the coin, right? And I don't think I can resolve this, and I'm very interested to hear what you think. But say in that thing late in the postlude, the fifth plane, when we come to Jekyll, with its incredible invention of, you know, very onerous rules, a class system, you know, this extra legal platform invents a class system and so on. And it's like heavily rule bound, you know, it's got sanctions, it chucks people out. It's far from a kind of libertarian or, you know, anarcho-collective kind of thing online. And so this really matters to me. And I use some Foucauldian thought, Nicholas Rose, governmentality ideas to think about, you know, the social diagram. But of course, how can these things can be inhabited in many ways. So there's that limit always of the reading that is deterministic. And I don't know, can I go any further with that, Tom? What can we do with that? We have to read the design. We have to take that very seriously. I feel corralled by social media all the time. And yet, where are we at with that?
I won't try and answer now, but it's a really great point. But I see where the determinism, I mean, I think of John Durnan Peters' piece, 2 Cheers for Technological Determinism, because, you know, the old television games had 4K max that could go in a cartridge, and you had to design a game around that. You could only have 8 moving objects. You could do creative things with multiplexing or whatever, but you couldn't go above 8 moving objects. And so, you know, and the way these things get, you know, so, you know, what do we mean by determinism, right? You know, and there's a lot of interesting stuff around ecology stuff in the physical world about how do environments shape conditions of possibility. So maybe determinism, the word, is tricking us up in some ways.
Did you have any thing on that? Belak?
Well, I was thinking about my own like a pre-digital kind of work, and I mean, I'm always looking for the ways in which people do unusual and creative things with their discs, you know, or by looking at the kinds of patterns of use of this stuff in particular kinds of situations. But you know, it requires, I think, looking at on many different layers to sort of see. I mean, my trope that I, you know, borrow like so many other people is friction, to kind of think across scales of kind of multinational corporate kind of governance, sort of like in making friction productive to kind of do this stuff, but then also the way that listeners themselves deploy, you know, these sorts of little sound technologies to do weird things, or set up little clubs, or have interesting little sort of scenarios. I don't think the question of technological determinism is necessarily different in digital cultures. And I think one of the huge kind of amazing, you know, exciting things for me in this book is the way that you kind of seem to, I don't know, maybe you disagree, refuse to sort of say that the digital is special. You know, there are emergent properties, but you're taking in a larger temporal, historical trajectories of media as well. I don't know that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. No, and particularly also working against the analog digital kind of binarisms. So I mean, Tom, your comments about boundaries and noticing boundaries are real. But at the same time, you know, we can't assume that there is. So when you said this thing about, you talked about Jenna Burrell quote, and you said, but there are sharp divisions, right? And I completely agree and understand. On the other hand, I think what I meant by citing that quote was the nature of the field work, which meanders, you know, on and off. You know, somebody's sitting there on a laptop, you know, doing the promo for the latest release on this digital label. And meanwhile, the bands are off touring Russia, you know, and so you go along, and then while you're there, you know, a sync happens and you're back up, you know. So you're constantly doing this kind of movement, which maybe is an illusion, you're saying, that of a fluidity, but somehow it feels like this fluidity of constant moving on and off and so on.
And I actually have to go away for just like 4 minutes in just a moment, so which is perfect. So I won't talk very long. But and you're very right. Like these distinctions are the distinctions are real. We don't want to turn everything into a gray mush. But for instance, if you look at an online community in Animal Crossing or a music community, it might be Animal Crossing and a website and a Discord chat and a local meetup group and a whole bunch of different things that's not limited to the Animal Crossing platform itself. And so that kind of stuff is always happening, but that is about a multiplicity of relations between things that still have discrete characteristics to them, right? And there's what really always rubs me the wrong way in some scholarship is language of blurring, because I think it literally blurs us from figuring out what the hell is actually going on, forgive my language, because you're getting a multiplicity of relationality, which is something you push on very hard in the book, which is really great, right? And so you're absolutely right. These things aren't discrete, but they're multiple, but they are discrete in the sense that between physical, but also online, offline, there are gaps, right? Zeros and ones, you can't have the digital without gaps. That ain't gonna happen. And so, but even in the physical world, so you're absolutely right that trying to look at something solely, these things are multiple in that sense, but the multiplicity is about relation across things that are discrete. So people who do Animal Crossing have a Discord chat, but they know damn well when they're in the Discord chat or when they're in Animal Crossing. They are discrete, but they are related. Right.
And that's actually a theme of the last ethnography, chapter 9, which is all about intermediality online and the use of particular platforms and media for different channels, which are all part of the practice and part of the aesthetic experience. So that's absolutely what we're doing there. But
I love it. That's great. Very nice discussion. And I think that we have 2 or 3 questions online, which maybe we'll go to first because they've been waiting. But please, those of us in the room, could you be getting your questions together and just give you a chance to be thinking about your questions before we do that. So if we could start with Guven Witveen, who's asked, it's a 2-way question. How would a music ethnographer of 1923 approach our 2023 movement in the new book launch by using 1923 habits of thought, different to today's authors, and the reverse? How might the 2023 contributors differ in thinking and digital tools for taking on a 1923 musicological subject? Ooh, tricky question. Thank you for asking. If you have any comment on that.
I'm not sure I have.
No.
Honestly. I can't really imagine someone in 1923, imagining what's going on now.
Yes.
So I don't get that one. I mean, I think the century jump is interesting. Maybe it relates to your
yes.
I can see it you again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think then I've this is my period. I live in 1920. But again, then I'm stuck with the jump forwards. Thinking. Generally, people in 1922 didn't think so much about us. I mean, I've done some work on futurism, but that's a weird avant-garde.
Yes.
So,
But maybe one could say something a bit trite, like in 1923, was the invention of things like collage, concrete poetry, artworks, major year for modernism, that fragmented, non-totalizing visual and literary forms, musical forms. And therefore, in a way, maybe behind your question is the idea that there really is a long century here of certain kinds of aesthetic experience and gesture. That's my best go.
Thank you. So maybe we'll just move to one other online and then we'll come to the audience here. This is from Evgenia Evpak. And she says, hello, and thanks to Georgina for a wonderful presentation. Here's a question. Music affection theory elicits certain affection patterns which are universal and ethnologically specific. Would you support or decline the hypothesis that in case relational table of universal music affection patterns is created and implemented, the copyright legislation will be spread on only unique ethnical or unique authors' music products, sorry, not projects, projects.
I think we have a problem of written
Yes.
questions,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
that one drifts a bit. But
yeah,
I, look, the kind of work I do, Evgeny,
yeah.
isn't really interested in positing. I think you said, these musical affections
Yes.
theory is both universal and yet
Yeah.
culturally specific. There's a
Yeah.
very interesting set of questions there. But this work isn't on the psychology of music or even musical affect much. There's some affect in there. So I probably don't have much to say.
We have we'll wait. We've got a couple of questions from Ivan Tacey, anthropologist. But before I go to him, what do we have questions from the room? From those of you present, anything that you would like to? Yes.
I just had a question around the idea of
Speak. If you may just speak up, because the mic is quite small in there.
I'll be louder. The question of decolonization within anthropological studies. What do you think the limitations are of using the term global north and global south, specifically thinking as like I'm Canadian? There are a lot of indigenous Inuit traditional throat singers combining that with digital art forms, for example, or even diasporic communities who create new digital art and influence like new genres in that way. But obviously Canada is in the north. So that kind of like general term to denote communities that have been typically marginalized.
There's a great footnote on that. I should read it out to you. But effectively, as we all know, these are kind of heuristic fictions. They're dualisms and have all the limitations of those kind of dualisms. So I completely bow to the observation that you've made and agree with it. In fact, it's the anthropologist Yael Navarro, Yashin, who writes a wonderful kind of reflection on the limits of this dualism. And yet, for the big story, the big argument that I am trying to make, one needs sometimes these heuristic shorthands. And so this idea that actually, look, it's time for us to be interested in questions of power, inequality, and justice as they inhere both within the North and within the South calling India of the South. These are productive shorthands, aren't they, for raising a series of questions. And I want to kind of turn you around to the disciplinary questions that I've put on the table provocatively. I mean, I mean them totally, but coming to the hallowed room of the Royal Anthropological Institute, I felt today, oh my goodness, I'm being a controversialist, but I really do mean it. And as I said, this was the idea of reconfiguring what anthropology was being signaled almost 40 years ago. At the time of, it came on the heels of Marxist anthropology, which was big in the 70s and early 80s when I studied. These are the key issues, I think. I hope you'd agree with me. It's not about kind of, picking like, where are there difficult power relations operative on marginalized communities. We know they are also in South Wales, so or in the northeast of England. But thank you for raising it. It's a very important point.
Yes, please.
I'd like to ask if you can share maybe, I was interested if there were any findings or anything that come out of the book. I didn't have the opportunity to, unfortunately, read it all, but I mean, in terms of the aspects of genre that we were talking about, if there were any findings that were interesting beyond the concept of fusion, which is, like one, I guess, way of saying that something is of one place and of another place and they enmesh. And I'm like curious if there's other things that like throw us in like other directions.
Yes, I could bore forever on this.
I'm sorry.
Just finishing the book on music and genre with the leading popular music scholar of genre, who's in McGill in Canada, called David Brackett. Wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called Categorizing Sound. It's all about, really about racism in the American music industry. Yes, we use genre theory quite a lot in the book, and the best chapter really is the one by Andy Eisenberg on Kenya, because to try to get to the quintessence, this is really exciting stuff, actually. I think you alluded to this, Gavin, in your comments, because what Andy's able to show, so he's getting down to the level of, of lively, innovative musicians and groups and labels. And what he finds, he gives portraits, particularly of one very successful duo who do, and he tells their story as they get into digital production technologies. And the story is this, that they're working with sort of EDM meets vernacular musics in Kenya. And why is it allowed? We're going across scales here, because there's been a liberalization of media regulation in Kenya. So that the ban on vernacular Kenyan musics, which has prevailed for decades, is lifted at the end of the 90s. And what that means is suddenly FM radio takes off, playing loads of ethnic music from all over Kenya. And it's hugely successful and popular. It's been pirated before, but now it's legit. So this duo comes along and they decide to fuse EDM, or bits of hip hop, and vernacular sounds. And they're going to create a new genre. And they know it's going to be popular if they get it right, because the vernacular sounds popular, hip hop's popular. So they do what Andy calls research. They play in the clubs, they play some stuff on radio, they keep honing the sound until they find a sound, a particular beat that they take. And this just takes off. It absolutely goes crazy. And what he says is that they're not only creating sound, they're very consciously forging a new audience. And that audience, for the first time in Kenya, is urban youth. That's the term, right? Emulating elsewhere. But it's never existed in Kenya before. And he goes further. So what he's saying is what genre does not only creates a new sound, a new aesthetic, but in doing so, it brings into a kind of affective coalition, people loving the music across ethnic lines. Suddenly, Nairobi youth come together and they hit the clubs and they're listening to the same music. So it has these kind of social effects. So genre is unbelievably interesting and important because it allows us to kind of get at these ways in which when you create a new sound, your Isaac Hayes, this is one of David's studies of Isaac Hayes, he does a crossover song. He takes a country song and he goes soul with it. He doesn't know if it's going to work. When it works, it brings his Black audience with him. And suddenly they're listening to country. Okay, country via Isaac Hayes, right? So these are at once aesthetic and social kinds of movement that genre theory allows us to access. It's just great. We should all be using it.
Fabulous answer, thank you. We've got one more, maybe we can go to one online and then come back to both of you. Ivan Tacey had two questions, but I think if we go to his second one, he did say, what a fantastic talk, project, presentation and discussion. And I'll move to his second question because he's asking about Global South and in the first one, which we've tackled. My second question concerns digital musical technologies. Although you showed slides of bric-a-brac African recording studios, in opposition to slick Western studios. I am unsure of whether this reflects reality. The pioneers of digital music encompass individuals with very limited access to resources. For example, Jamaicans built their own studios in which all kinds of technologies were built from scratch. A similar situation existed with pioneers of techno and house in Detroit and Chicago, who had really limited budgets and thus used cheap technologies to produce incredible sounds. Things have accelerated further since then, further blurring geographical and technical boundaries. I feel the key issue may concern legal rights over music and the way. So it's just jumped. And the way in which profits from digital music productions are distributed. I would love to hear your comments.
Yeah, you're talking to the converted. I completely agree. I've written a lot about low-tech creativity and innovation. No, I showed you a Nairobi recording studio that was very well equipped. And the point was simply to make the rather crude and banal point that Brian Larkin's kind of paradigm for how technologies hit the global south is no longer sufficient for understanding what's going on. Our study in Cuba, Alex Fournier's study in Cuba, is all about the extraordinary creative uses of extremely limited access to tech. So I'm completely with you. I can't remember the second point.
Covered, that's good, because we've got some more questions in the room, if that's all right. Maybe, yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I'm really new to anthropology as a discipline, and I'm currently doing the MSc in digital anthropology at UCL. And I recently read an article as part of one of our classes about Spotify recommendation algorithms and how they're like changing the creative process of music making. And I was just wondering, you mentioned Jekyll, for example, which I'd never heard of, and also Spotify and so on. I was just wondering if you had any like thoughts about that argument in terms of your ethnographic research and in the context of this book and what you're trying to do in terms of how the platforms themselves and I guess the algorithms that sit behind them and how they try to get music to listeners and so on, and sort of changing the way that music is being created.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great question. In fact, it's my current project, which is on AI and music, which is addressing this really. This is quite a recent set of debates happening, and recommendation algorithms are a very big challenge, right? And yes, I completely agree that there's a lot of critical writing on the black boxing of how recommendation is working. We know that there are certain techniques. We know that there's a vast industry of computer scientists, one of whom I'm collaborating with actually, who are devoted to constantly tinkering with these things. And, you know, sometimes under the rubric of fairness, accountability, transparency, ethical AI, and so on and so forth. But to give a headline from my current work, what's very interesting to see, and this, by the way, the anthropologist who's best addressed this is a former student at Tom's own department, the Department of Anthropology at Irvine, Nick Seaver, who's big guy. That's who you read. So Nick Seaver is actually looking in his book, Compute and Paste, at the culture behind this field, music information retrieval, and how it conceptualizes, you know, listeners, what listeners want and need. I'm here to tell you, as Seaver develops at length, you know, we are all, we find it impossible to parse the global archive of online music. Folks, we need recommendation engines, because otherwise we would feel at sea, lost in a sea of unfathomable hugeness of music online. So that's how they justify what they're doing. And then, as you know, there are the various techniques that feed us more of what they think we want. So I'm critical of all this. I'm writing about it now, partly through this partnership with a recommendation engineer. I think it's fascinating. I mean, at the moment, I'm more concerned with how it, it's a word for today, corrals. It encompasses and shapes our listening. And the way that it shapes our listening, the presumptions that lie behind the idea that if I like this music and someone with this, who's listening to the same music and also like that, that means I will also like that. These kind of presumptions. I think we need much more on this, but I think let's begin with a model of the listening subject that is immanent in this, which is, I mean, it's hilariously inane. And as to creativity, that's the next question.
I would also just sort of say in the chapter on I think it's Blake Durham's chapter.
Yeah.
There's that you co-wrote as well. There's an amazing section on sort of taking a very Marxist, post-Marxist kind of stance on these questions about how the listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, are doing work for the platform, and that kind of labor is making the platform tick, you know, that kind of thing. So there's really, really interesting kind of interventions in the book too.
Yeah, we end up with a big blast of Marx, because we find a perfect quote, actually, and via Italian Marxists, Werner and so on. There's absolutely beautiful classic sections from Marx that transpose just wonderfully on the kind of accumulation and extraction of affective labor in the current parlance, and how this is being mined and commercialized by the platforms. So absolutely, great topic.
Yeah, if you've got time.
Yes,
Huge thanks for that. I just, this is really banal, but probably works as a question. You put lots of you talk about provocations in the book. This has been a pattern. I remember reading your EACAM book, and this idea of provocations to the disciplines, actually multiple disciplines, you sort of say, right, here you go, now think about it, and then, you know, next project. While doing that, do you also see your work as fundamentally therefore optimistic about where these disciplines can go? I was wondering if this, you sort of plant this sort of seed, this bomb, and then hope that it will get picked up. So I wondered where you see this going. What is the future of this work? Does it, you know, may or may not involve you, but is there a sort of, are you hopeful basically? Is that what your work is all about? Hopeful where this might go?
Wow, what a lovely question. Thank you very much. Yeah. I mean, I guess I have to be, right? I mean, yes, and I do know that from the next generations, there are people who totally resonate. I mean, I'm looking at you, you were at the ethnography thing, weren't you, the other day? I'm the person in front of you. We had a session on music ethnography at King's a week ago or so. And there was a room of about 30 of us, including a lot of graduate students. And, you know, the critique I've developed here of ethnomusicology, the limits of the term and of the kind of current framing of the discipline was shared by many people in the room. And I was just struck by, well, yes, you know. Now, you know, if we talked over a glass of wine in 10 minutes about this, you know, there's always another side. And the other side, Gavin, you alluded quite rightly to the real politique of academia today. Precarity, you know, the lack of jobs, the strikes, the huge battles that any of us who are entering, any of you entering academia are facing. And that's when I've had friends and colleagues say to me, but you can't destroy, you can't say, you know, let's not have that anymore. Ethnomusicology has only just been allowed into Britain's music departments, you know? Yeah. Like if you look at Durham or Bristol or Cambridge, Oxford, you know, now there are 2 maybe, or sometimes 3. And this is important. It is it's an improvement on what was, you know, the whole of 19th century historical musicology. So I'm just trying to say that I am optimistic. I mean, with me, you know, I've never just been able to do something else. If I could have inhabited something comfortably, I would have, but it's not how my brain works. So I don't say it's, you know, but I also think that, you know, this thing about disciplinary change is a really, really urgent topic as you said, Anne, when we began, I helped to found a new section of the British Academy called
Yeah.
Culture, Media and Performance.
Yeah.
Now, we did it because the Academy had nothing representing media studies, cultural studies, performance studies,
And now dance.
and dance.
Now there's a fellow for dance.
Yeah,
Yep.
and Teresa and so on. So,
Teresa, yeah.
you know, this has been like helping these things to happen. You all feeling free, you know, feel free to read outside the given canon. I mean, this is incredibly important, I think, because the world is changing and we have to change, you know, with it. Yeah.
Thank you again for the talk. I mean, digitalization has allowed, well, to achieve incredible things, of course, but at the same time, its growth in reach and scale has taken it everywhere, basically. So now this gets to really remote communities, and it has both material effects, I mean, consumption, production, and also those public practices Gavin was mentioning, but also these like immaterial effects, like changing ideas, perceptions that at the same time impact worldviews on very like remote communities and taking back these power relations like north, south, and everything. How could we, if possible, regulate all these like process and power relations through music that happen all the time and that shifts again the worldviews, and yeah, how to address these, regulate from a both biocultural and ethic point of view.
Thank you so much. Once again, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the way you set the question up, but it's also reminding me of the current work on AI, because some of the best scholarship on the, you know, back to Tom, I mean, these things aren't like immediately tangible, but they're just as material. I'm talking about the vast consumption of resources that goes into supporting this whole infrastructure that reaches now into the Rajasthani desert. I mean, as you were speaking, I was remembering when I went on field work with Aditi Deer in Rajasthan. She took a camel ride one day, and I was too chicken to go on the camel. So I went with one of the guys just walking across the desert. And we'd walked for a couple of hours, and he got his phone out. And he began to text somebody, you know, in the next town. And it just, you know, here we were, sort of like 50 miles from the nearest conurbation. And in the middle of that desert, you know, there's still the signal, you know. And so I guess what your question made me think about was, again, you know, this whole problem of environmental humanities, which is the pulling up the drawbridge after us. We've had all this stuff, you know, is it benefiting from it? Tom being here with us live and so on and so forth. But at what cost? At this gigantic cost. And actually, I'm sorry to, you know, I'm quite near the end of my career. I'm getting older. And actually, I find myself more and more having the deepest questioning of our reliance on this stuff. And I don't know when I retire if I'll continue to do it. I really don't know, on the grounds that, you know, can we justify this obscene consumption of resources, which, as one of the best writers on this is Kate Crawford, who writes an Atlas of AI, in which she traces, rather like Kyle Devine traces in his Political Ecology of Music, she traces the labor process and the whole infrastructural chain of goods, the extraction of rare metals, which rapes the earth, that lie behind our addiction to these digital technologies. And one really wonders, you know, how can we defend it? Can we defend it at this time with this crisis? Sorry to get apocalyptic, but that's how I feel.
Well, I think that's, I mean, it's a wonderful ending. We've had both the optimistic, no, we had that in the previous question, and then we've had the serious nature of what we're all confronting now. But I think I'd like to join everybody online and in the room to say thank you to all three, particularly to Georgina and to our two respondents, to say thank you very much for a really delightful and inspiring and informative session. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I think, Henning, let's just check. Sadly, we can't offer Tom a glass of wine. We can offer you a virtual glass of wine. But, if anybody would like to stay
Fresh
for half
orange.
an hour.